the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so Iranian Americans expect Republicans and Democrats to come together in a bipartisan fashion to show tangible support for the people of Iran. And indeed, in recent weeks, we've begun to see just that bipartisan movement in support of the Massa Act on Capitol Hill. So it is to that end that our team has developed the maximum support policy. NUFDI's maximum support policy, which we are honored to formally unveil to you today, is the culmination of months of work between Iranian American activists, experts from think tanks across the ideological spectrum, and leading dissidents inside Iran. Maximum support is based on the principle that American policy must move beyond the clearly failed expectation of behavior change from this regime and unequivocally support the Iranian people's fundamental call for political change. Today, we are proud to formally announce Maximum Support, a 15-point strategic initiative to support the Iranian people. Maximum support is a second step to maximum pressure. We believe that maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic is necessary. Holding the regime accountable for its crimes against the Iranian people is not only a movement for freedom, is absolutely necessary. And indeed, pressure on the Islamic Republic is a form of support of the Iranian people because it comparably weakens the regime, and maximum support of the Iranian people is a form of pressure on the regime because it empowers, emboldens, and strengthens the people vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic. First, the U.S. government must announce a strategic policy shift in its Iran policy. The president should publicly address the American people in support of the Iranian people's movement for secular democracy, and each of these 15 points is outlined, of course, in the booklet that you have on your seats. I won't go through every single point. You can read it here, and it's available publicly on our website as well. But maximum support begins with a formal strategic realignment of U.S. policy and the president coming out formally in support of the Iranian people's right to determine their future and right to a secular democracy. Second, do no harm. The U.S. government should unequivocally state that it supports Iran's territorial integrity as a matter of international law and that it would not engage formerly listed terrorist organizations, that it would not engage armed insurgent groups or any groups that do not respect and recognize Iran's territorial integrity, because there may be groups that are enemies of the Islamic Republic, but these groups are no friends of America and they're no friends of the Iranian people. And U.S. policy should not undermine the historic relationship between the American people and the Iranian people. Third, highlight human rights abuses. The State Department needs to reopen a portal for NGOs and Iranians and Iranian Americans to submit evidence of human rights violations against the Iranian people, which was active in the previous administration, and hold regular meetings with human rights groups and Iranian Americans and dissidents across the country to inform their policy. They must take into account, the Treasury Department must take into account this information from Iranian Americans and from other groups when listing individuals on their SDN list to ensure that those who commit crimes against the Iranian people are held accountable for the crimes that they commit. And congressional committees, those relevant, must invite Iranian dissidents and Iranian Americans to testify before the Congress so that the Congress can hear directly from dissidents, directly from Iranian Americans about the crimes committed by this regime. Fourth, hold the regime leadership accountable. The State Department and the Justice Department must coordinate with U.S. allies to ensure that Interpol, the International Police Agency, executes on red notices for Islamic regime officials who travel abroad, and that they cannot travel without impunity, with impunity to foreign countries and insult the Iranian people by finding for its own use. Many of those resources are now abroad and have been frozen by foreign governments, but some of those resources are still in transit in violation of U.S. sanctions. So the U.S. government must seize the tankers transporting sanctioned Iranian oil, sell that oil on the open market, and use those resources to support funds to support Iranian strikers and the families of Iranian political prisoners and those who have been killed by the Islamic Republic. One critical component of maximum support in compiling this, our policy team has ensured that as little of American taxpayer money as possible is used, and indeed, nearly every single proposal in the 15-point maximum support policy are ones that can be funded by the Islamic Republic's own dollars. Whereas in the past, the United States has often spent hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to support democracy abroad. Some of those funds can be repurposed, but in the case of Iran, this money belongs to the Iranian people. It does not belong to the Islamic Republic, and those resources should be returned to their rightful owners, the people of Iran. And Congress, in terms of the oil sanctions, must ensure that the administration, which it is currently failing or refusing to do, enforces the existing oil sanctions on the Islamic Republic, because the Islamic Republic is using Iran's national wealth and national resources to fund its campaign of violence against the Iranian people. Number 7, isolate the regime internationally. We have seen already fantastic campaigns led by Iranian American women activists and with the support and leadership of Iranians inside the country to remove the Islamic Republic from the Commission on the Status of Women at the United Nations. The Islamic Republic must continue to be isolated internationally from all international fora and reduce their presence to a de minimis one, including in areas of sport. We must follow the Russian model and ensure that Iranian athletes are still able to compete at international events, but that they are not able to compete under the Islamic Republic's flag or with the Islamic Republic's anthem. And in other ways, the United Nations and other international bodies must, under pressure from the U.S. diplomatic corps, from the State Department, and in coordination with our allies, must limit the Islamic Republic's presence in international fora, because the Islamic Republic's diplomats are not representative, as we all know, of Iran's national interests, but of the Islamic Republic's acute ideological and political interests, and reducing their presence on the international stage, and as we'll see in coming points, raising the profile of the Iranian people and the secular democratic opposition to the Islamic Republic is critical. Place meaningful limitations on regime officials' affiliates. For 4 decades, the Islamic Republic has taken most every semblance of joy from the Iranian people. However, the offspring and the children of the Islamic Republic's officials who live off of the stolen wealth of the Iranian nation often do so in luxe and debaucherous lives abroad. The United States must make it a matter of policy to urge allies to prevent the sale of golden visas to Islamic Republic officials, so that those connected to the regime are not living off the Iranian people's stolen wealth in countries across Europe while the Iranian people suffer as their wealth has already been confiscated. And we must work with allies to form, based off the Russian model after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to form an international task force to track down the Iranian people's stolen assets and the assets that are being used abroad, which have been taken from them. 9, provide cyber and intelligence support. U.S. National Security Council and other national security agencies must provide maximum transparency to the Iranian people. For 4 decades, the Islamic Republic has thrived under a complete blackout on its activities and has lied to the Iranian people day in and day out. And U.S. cyber and intelligence sources should be used to offer the Iranian people information on the Islamic Republic's activities, on the Islamic Republic's levels of corruption, and when Iranian protesters are in the streets, just as the Islamic Republic attempts to cut off their communications by limiting access to internet, U.S. and allied cyber and intelligence sources should act to even the playing field for the people of Iran and remove the Islamic Republic's communications and intelligence sources offline and provide an even playing field to the Iranian people. U.S. government intelligence assets and our allies have access to very important information that could show the Iranian people although they already know this, to show to a greater degree the level of corruption and criminality of this regime, and the Iranian people deserve maximum transparency. 10. Develop a clear communications and messaging strategy. Just as the first point outlined that the Islamic Republic necessitates a strategic shift in American policy, the U.S. government's communication at all levels needs to be clear and consistent to the Iranian people. The U.S. government, from the president all the way down, needs to tell the Iranian people that they stand with them in their fight for secular democracy, that they support their right to determine their own destiny. The U.S. government should hire a Persian language communications director to communicate with the Persian language media, to communicate with the Iranian people and the Iranian American community, to highlight U.S. government policies and to continuously reiterate the American government's support for the Iranian people. And this person would work in conjunction with another proposed component of maximum support, which is a deputy to a special envoy, not the current special envoy, to support human rights and democracy in Iran, because the United States needs a coordinator for Iran policy focused on the issue of human rights and democracy to coordinate interagency policy on Iran. 11. Engage the secular democratic opposition. Just as it's critical to limit the U.S. government's engagement with the Islamic Republic and with groups who would act counter to Iran's national interests or who would not support Iran's territorial integrity, it is critical for the Iranian people to see that the U.S. government, from the executive branch and in the Congress, are engaging popular representatives of the secular democratic opposition in Iran. Because for far too long, U.S. policy and even international policy has focused only on engaging the problem and not the potential solution to the problem. So the secular democratic opposition needs to be engaged at high levels by the executive branch and in the Congress. And indeed, just early this month, we saw very excellent examples of that in Europe, and we need to see more of that in the United States. 12, engage the Iranian American community. The Iranian American community is an incredible asset for the United States, and for the past 4 decades, many have made America their home. But they can also play an important role in the transition to secular democracy and in the rebuilding of Iran after the fall of the Islamic Republic. In the past, we've seen parties at the White House to celebrate Nowruz with little to no mention of the Islamic Republic's war against the Iranian people. But the White House can use the power of the presidency, the power of the bully pulpit, to highlight the Iranian people's movement for secular democracy and host Iranian American activists and dissidents at the White House and talk about the promise of a future, different, secular, democratic Iran. And in addition to that, the U.S. government has to support efforts by Iranian Americans who are preparing for the economic and social reconstruction and redevelopment of Iran after the fall of the Islamic Republic. 13, reform U.S. media and broadcasting. For too many years, if you were to talk about changing Iran policy or supporting the Iranian people in Washington, often the only answer you would hear was to reform the VOA or to reform Radio Farda. But as you can see, there is much more to supporting the Iranian people, but that point still stands. The U.S. Agency for Global Media has remarkable assets that can be better used to support the Iranian people's movement for democracy, including by combining Radio Farda and the VOA Persian service into one Office for Iran Broadcasting, modeled off of the Office for Cuba Broadcasting, and streamline the U.S. government's Persian language resources. U.S. government Persian language media should also use the resources it has at its disposal, including access to high-level government officials, to U.S. information, to bring exclusive information to the Iranian people and become the source that it should be in competition with private language Persian language media alternatives. 14, review and revitalize State Department Iran funding. For too long, and sometimes thanks to some groups here in Washington, D.C., Iran's democracy promotion funding at the State Department has been siphoned off to other projects or other sources that would not promote democracy, but that would promote particular ideological or political aims. Congress should request consistently and repeatedly a full audit of and impact analysis of State Department Iran funding to ensure that funding for Iran is going towards programs and individuals that actually promote secular democracy in Iran, that actually promote America's values, and that are not used for programs or projects that would even often act counter to American interests and American values. And 15, investigate the Islamic Republic's influence operations in the United States. All of us are very familiar with the levels of influence by the Islamic Republic here in Washington. Oftentimes, this happens, as much as we may disagree with it and find it immoral as it is, this happens legally. However, if and where illegal lobbying or influence operations by the Islamic Republic are happening on American soil, and particularly here in Washington, the Justice Department, as it has been called to do by members of the Senate in the past, should investigate influence and infiltration operations by the Islamic Republic, including in higher education, based off the model in the previous administration to investigate the Chinese Communist Party's infiltration into American universities. And Congress should act to ensure that any operations or organizations deemed to be part of influence operations by the Islamic Republic be denied funding, especially if they're universities, by the Department of Education. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you'll see in your booklets, as you'll see throughout the day, Iran policy and supporting the people of Iran is not just a pie-in-the-sky idea. Policymakers have tangible, implementable solutions in order to support the people of Iran. Now, we do not say that maximum support is the be-all, end-all. In fact, we believe this is a starting point for further conversation, for the further implementation, for the further developments of ideas, implementable solutions to support the people of Iran. Because now, at this moment in their history, at this moment where the United States has an opportunity to align our interests and our values, it is too important of a time not to be asking these questions, too important of a time, and it's too important of an issue for U.S. national security, economic security, and our values not to be talking about these issues. And for NUFDI, this is an issue that we will continue to focus on. We are going to continue to work to implement as many of these components as possible, continue to add to this list, but now is a time for Iran policy to take a new direction. And we hope that with the introduction of maximum support, in addition to maximum pressure on the Islamic Republic, U.S. policymakers will now have a comprehensive Iran policy framework. It's no longer okay to say, what can we do about it? When the Iranian American community, when policymakers, when those inside Iran are offering policymakers, offering legislators, offering the administration, offering those sitting just across the street from us solutions, it's no longer defensible to say, what can we do? Because the solutions are available. And throughout the day, we'll be discussing a bit more about these and a bit more about the idea of maximum support. So thank you very much. Please continue to review those documents as we go throughout the day. But it's my pleasure to introduce our first panel for the day, which will be moderated by NUFDI Advisory Council member, attorney, and author, and a dear friend of our organization, Afshineh Latifi. And Afshineh will introduce the speakers in the panel. We'll discuss how did we get here and the 4 decades of U.S. policy towards Iran.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you, Your Highness, for being here, to be here. I'm going to start off by giving a quick introduction of our panel this morning. We have Brian Katulis. He is a senior fellow and VP of policy at the Middle East Institute. He was formerly a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he built the Center's Middle East program, and also worked on broader issues involving national security. Brian has produced influential studies that have shaped important discussions around regional policy, providing expert testimony to key congressional committees on his findings. He's also conducted extensive research in countries such as Egypt, Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. His past experiences include work at the National Security Council, U.S. Department of State and Defense, and I understand that he just recently came back from Saudi Arabia. Welcome, Brian. Thank you for being here. We have our very own Navid Mohebbi. Navid is born and raised in Iran. He's NUFDI's advocacy director. He's a longtime democracy advocate, former political prisoner in Iran. He's written extensively on Iran's political and social affairs in both Persian and English. He has worked with many civil society organizations in Iran on a range of political, human rights issues, and women's rights issues. Navid has a BA in International Relations and Middle East Studies from George Washington University and an MA in Security Studies from University of Massachusetts. Thank you for being here. Behnam Ben Taleblu is a senior fellow at FDD, where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. He previously served as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst at FDD. Prior to working there, Behnam worked on the non-proliferation issues at an arms-controlled think tank in Washington. He has also closely tracked a wide range of Iran-related topics, including sanctions, nuclear non-proliferation, the IRGC, foreign security policies of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. He has testified before U.S. Congress and the Canadian Parliament, and he's frequently called upon to brief of NUFDI's 15 points on maximum support for Iran. And I thought I'd just kick off the discussion with a question, the first question to Navid, and say, why do you think America needs a new policy on Iran, and what has been missing and what has been wrong from previous American strategies towards Iran?
Thank you, Latif. I would like to welcome everyone to today's NUFDI's event, and especially His Highness Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. To answer your question, I would like to review what has been the source of conflict between Islamic Republic regime in Iran and United States. These issues were Iran's ballistic missile program, Iran's nuclear program, and the regional aggression. Not only all of these issues worsened compared to 10, 15 years ago, but new threats have surfaced since then. We have now the issue of cyber threats. We have seen the Iranian regime attacking Children's Cancer Hospital in Massachusetts. We have seen the Iranian regime meddling in the U.S. election in 2020. And most importantly, the issue that has been going on in the past 10 years is that Iranian regime is trying to attack and go after Iranian dissidents and American citizens on the U.S. soil. When I review the ODNI's annual threat reports on Iran, every year they report that the Iranian regime threats, multidimensional threats, continue to increase, or they remain the same. So I think that the discourse of Iran-U.S. policy and the way in which United States used to view the Iranian threats have suffered a setback. United States views of, for example, terrorist groups in the region was based on destroying them or defeating them. We have seen that in the case of ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But when it comes to Iranian terrorist groups and proxies, United States no longer tries to defeat them or eliminate their threats. United States have accepted groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad movement, and Houthis as existing realities. And that is because the weakness of United States, the lack of dedication and persistence on pursuing its national interest, and also because its policies and its strategies didn't work well. And for example, in case of terrorist groups in the region, the Iranian regime, through its proxies, has been able to have frozen conflicts all around the Middle East. Through Houthis, they are threatening Saudis. It's a frozen conflict, and the Iranian regime has the upper hand. It was able to impose Houthis to Yemeni people. Iraq is basically run by Iranian militant groups. We know the case of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So none of the US policies in the region have worked. And that's why I think that maybe we need a new policy. And I think maximum pressure, maximum support policy here makes sense. We have tried, only sanctions. We have tried the so-called diplomacy with the Islamic Republic regime, and all these policies work. So what do you have to lose? Let's try something new. And I think that maximum support policy can be one option.
Thank you. And Behnam, along those same lines, how has the Iran debate changed over time, and how has that been in line or out of line with the Iranian society and the realities on the ground in Iran?
Well, thank you so much for that question. It's great to share the panel with all of you, not virtually, thankfully. So we're doing this in person, which is always a blessing in Washington. And thank you to NUFDI for organizing and really Cameron for spearheading so much of this project, and also greetings again to Your Highness. Listen, for a very long time, the U.S. government's Iran policy was animated by the structure of its national security bureaucracy, meaning you have a department in the Department of State that focuses on Middle East issues. You have functional bureaus that cover things like arms control. You have a Department of Defense that looks at security issues. You have a National Security Council that is supposed to aggregate all of these and provide policy recommendations to the U.S. government. The problem with that approach was the consistent stovepiping of all of the threats that Navi just went into great detail with. The missile issue, the cyber issue, the human rights issue, the terrorism issue, the regional destabilization issue, the illicit financial issues. So it disconnected the dots. That's the key reason we got to where we are, the key reason for the policy impasse, or if you want to be so bold, the policy failure on Iran for 4+ decades. A consistent disconnecting the dots and a settling for the lowest common denominator of what is the least that the U.S. can do with the most impact to get away with. Sometimes this was for pure political reasons this was done. Sometimes it was framed as realpolitik, but oftentimes it merely reflected America seeing the world through the structure of its national security bureaucracy, segmented, rather than adapting its national security bureaucracy to the reality on the ground. And that's a changing reality that Naveed is talking about. You know, the Islamic Republic is a challenging adversary, not because it's particularly rich, not because its leaders are particularly Kissingerian, but because its leaders adapt. And there is, unfortunately, in the 4+ decades of this kind of frozen U.S.-Iran Cold War or conflict, you could say, there is evidence for the Islamic Republic to draw on to do the things that it does and get away with it, most unfortunately. You can go back and find declassified documents from the CIA that talk about unless we make the regime pay a cost for terrorism, they're going to continue this. You can go back and find all of this stuff is being discussed in the U.S. government. It's not like the people across the street or the previous people across the street, whether they have an R or a D in front of the name, are unaware of these issues. But they're not connecting the dots on these issues. And I guess that's really the key point I wanted to hammer home for maximum support today. And really, no one can kind of hammer it away better than Cameron himself. It was formed in isolation to the reality on the ground. So long as you have a policy that is going to be formed in isolation from that reality, whether it's a hawkish policy towards Iran or a dovish policy towards Iran, you're not going to get the policy solution or the policy outcome that you want. And, you know, this is also, we have to be brutally honest with ourselves. This is the month of March 2023. It's the 20th anniversary of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. The U.S.'s own missteps and experiences in the region also colors and informs the way it looks at the rest of the region. So we cannot have a conversation about a sustainable U.S.-Iran policy today without talking about some of the costs that the U.S. has, some would say wrongly, spent or placed in the past. And one of the key things Kamran mentioned, and again I want to hammer this home, is the sustainability of something like maximum support, because again, it's not costing U.S. taxpayers anything. So for many years, we've disconnected these dots for political interest, for financial cost, for merely imposing the way the bureaucracy is set up to deal with the world. And it's, I think, high time we change that and adapt to this new reality, because the problem is our adversary is adapting.
Thank you very much. Brian, just turning it to you for a little bit. How do you think America can develop a policy for Iran that addresses both its values and interests, and how do you feel about maximum support? Do you think that's the right strategy and the right course for America to take?
Great, thank you. And thanks to NUFDI and Cameron for a really impressive report and presentation. Let's be clear about what this report does, and it's an ambitious agenda. It recenters the people of Iran, which have been missing for decades in the policy and political debates here in the United States and around the world. So congratulations to those of you who've dedicated time and energy to lifting up some of these ideas and voices. It's an ambitious agenda. It comes at I think, a pivotal moment, clearly months into these protests where the brave young men and women of Iran are standing up for their own rights and freedom. And I think to answer your question, both of your questions, I do think that this offers a useful template for lifting up those considerations that have been pushed to the sidelines for far too long. I do think also that there are certain obstacles in implementing this agenda to marry America's interests and values in today's Middle East and in this world. Many of those obstacles are right here in this town when we're talking about U.S. foreign policy. And I'll just highlight three of them. One is the hyper-partisanship that we have in this town on every single issue. And unfortunately, for a number of reasons, the issue of Iran and the people of Iran have become somewhat of a red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat issue. And I do think that the protests and the fact that the Biden administration's plan A of simply just rejoining the JCPOA didn't work out presents an opportunity. But here we are, more than two years into the Biden administration, and we haven't yet seen the broad rethink. So I think the ideas contained in this report offer a template that both Republicans and Democrats can get behind. But that's a tough order with 2024 looming fast and people launching presidential campaigns. So on this first point, the hyperpartisanship, what I would recommend to the organizers and the people behind these ideas, because I work at a think tank, a Middle East Institute, where we do analysis. We weigh costs and benefits. We've been around for 76 years. I see this as a very strong advocacy document. It's one that you want to try to build support for on both sides of the aisle, no matter what different candidates or different leaders in Congress try to do. It's hard to do that. I think it would be easy if we have a scenario where the Biden administration simply tries to muddle through with its own sort of sticking to plan A or maybe plan B-ish, but not really adapting things. The impulse to sort of go very partisan on this issue will be quite strong. What I'm saying is don't do that. If you're trying to lift up the voices of the Iranian people, the long game requires building bipartisan support here in the U.S. So that's the one challenge, hyperpartisanship. Second is a simple bandwidth challenge. Bandwidth in terms of attention and time. I just assume that the people in this room have a deep love and appreciation for Iran and the people of Iran. Getting this right also requires you to understand how this ranks and racks and stacks in the relative order and priority of the U.S. national security interests and values. First and foremost, we got a lot of problems here at home. Second, China, Russia, the war in Ukraine. So to the extent that you can connect what's going on in Iran to that broader strategic landscape and not simply solely advocate for the people of Iran, which is a good thing to do, but connect it to the interests and to the emerging strategies of what the U.S. is trying to get done. What I find, which leads to my third point about the report, there are certain places where I would beef things up in connecting it with the current approach and trying to adapt the current U.S. approach. Number one, quite clearly, Iran's support for Russia's war in Ukraine is something that has caught the attention of this administration and deep concern on a bipartisan level. I would dig deeper in actually using that as a point of entry to talk about this is why it's necessary for you to reformulate your policy, not just for the people of Iran, but also for your own self-stated interests and values. Second, what I see as a relative gap, and again, hopefully we can talk about this, and it's where I focus on, is the regional strategy, the regional reconfiguration that I think is happening. These attempts at de-escalation, and you saw the agreement that Beijing reportedly announced, it announced, but we'll see if there's any detail behind it between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But these regional concerns, I think, are high, and it needs to be threaded through is the main point. And last but not least, and I know the report says discard the JCPOA, but we need to have a clearer answer on the questions of non-proliferation and what needs to be done. And I think you can do both. I think you can offer a policy or a strategy and a set of ideas, like this report does, offering maximum support to the people of Iran, but you need to attend to these other questions to get your voice in the room, to get attention from Republicans and Democrats, to get, if there's going to be any hope for the Biden administration in its last year and a half in its first term, to shift its Iran policy in a strategic way, in the way that Cameron and NUFDI has advocated. Thanks.
Navid, back to you. What do you think the relationship is between pressure on the Iranian regime and support of the Iranian people? And what do you think? Do you think that's something that the Iranian people want?
So over the past 6 years, since 2017, 2018, we have seen 6 massive uprisings in Iran. And people were very clear in their demands what they want. If you watch the videos of Iranian protesters chanting, they said that they want the end of the Islamic Republic regime. And so, unfortunately, many of those uprisings didn't get international media attention. And when I see the media talking about Iran, and they usually compare the current protests in Iran, Mahsa Amini protests, to that of 2009 protests. But we had 6 massive uprisings in between. They didn't get international media attention. So contrary to what the media often says, that the protests started after the death of Mahsa Amini, I think that's wrong. It resumed. These protests resumed after the death of Mahsa Amini. The real revolution in Iran started in 2017, 2018. People in more than 120 cities came to the street, and since then we had ongoing protest movement in Iran. We can talk about why it didn't get the media attention, but I can tell you that this is not a single incident. The Mahsa Amini protest, it was not a single incident. We have an ongoing, vibrant democracy movement in Iran. People are making clear that every 6 months, every 8 months, people come to the street, even though the regime is brutal, killing hundreds of people, but Iranians are still risking their life because they are fed up. And the reason that I believe these kind of protests are going to continue in Iran is because the underlying cause that brought people over the past 6 years to the street, they remain to exist today. The Iranian regime was not able to provide a solution for economic crisis in Iran, for high inflation in Iran. And also I can tell you that it is not just economic demands that the Iranian regime is not able to deliver the needs of the people, but also the characteristics of Iranian society has changed. Their values have changed. The young generation, they want to be part of the political decision making in their country. The women of Iran, they will not put up with the gender apartheid system in Iran. So we have a regime, and then we have an Iranian nation that their values is not the same. There's a huge gap between the values of Iranian people and the values of the Islamic Republic regime, which is a minority trying to hold its grip on power through oppression. So that's why, because they have not been able to deliver the needs of the people, because their norm and their values is incompatible with the Iranian people, and because we have a vibrant democracy movement in Iran, it was not just one single incident over the past 6 years. Is that I think Iranians are very clear in what they want, and also they look at the neighboring countries. Yes, many of Iran neighbors are not democracies. They don't have political openness in their countries, but those countries are at least able to deliver economic prosperity for their people, and they have social freedoms. But Iranian people have none of that. And that's why I think that these protests are going to continue. It was also echoed, the same fact, by the CIA director, that the U.S. IC community assessment is that the protests in Iran are going to continue. And I believe that United States should pay attention for this ongoing protest, because it poses an opportunity for United States to seize upon. And when you know that your policies have failed regarding on Iran, and when we have a policy proposal like a maximum support, maybe it's time to invest on the Iranian people. And I think that this is going to work very well. Iran issues and the threat that is posing to the United States are too big to tackle with just sanctions. Or we have to be honest with ourselves. You cannot, deal with the Iranian regional aggression through sanctions. It's too late. Maybe it could work, 10 years ago, if even 5 years ago, if you have continued the maximum pressure campaign. But now it's too late. You have to look for a new policy. You have to cut the head of the snake, and that's the Islamic Republic. We need to have a government that is focused on the national interest of the Iranian people and the Iranian nation, and a government that is looking for coexistence with the Western community and the civilized nation.
Do you want me to sing?
On that note, yes. Yes, the support is.
Shall we dance?
Okay, well. We're just having a little moment.
Is this like the Gong Show?
I know. It's the Oscars. It's the Oscars. I have to cut it. Yes, the Oscars. I have to walk away. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you, Navid. I agree with you. I think that one-dimensional sanctions only, maximum pressure time is over. And it's time to just have it as a multi-step
And by the way,
progress.
I was not saying these kind of things as an Iranian who wants to see a free Iran. I'm saying this as a neutral analyst, looking through the lens of U.S. national interest. All these issues are just getting worse day by day, and it's time for the United States to come up with a new policy.
Thank you. Behnam, do you foresee that there could ever be a time where we can move beyond a policy towards Iran that's this one-dimensional focus on the nuclear issue, and then look for a long-term solution? And do you think that maximum support is something that can fit that mold?
I'll be uncharacteristically candid and just say yes, but not right now. Not right now, because the political imperatives that Brian mentioned continue to govern the kind of psychology of the way the Biden administration is looking at the Iran issue. In terms of political capital they're willing to spend, it's clear they're not willing to go all the way. In terms of their ordering of strategy in the Middle East, they continue to see Iran primarily, but not exclusively, but primarily through the nuclear lens. So long as those pair of glasses are on, you will be blind to some of these movements. And it's really great to see the Treasury Department and even many U.S. partners and allies, from Australia to New Zealand to Canada to the UK to the EU. Shout out to everybody who has, since September, been trying to find ways to stand with the Iranian people. My concern with that, however, is the sanctions and the pressure and the good speeches and the moral support and the wind beneath the wings given in all of those different iterations of pressure will be merely ornamental, like little ornaments on a Christmas tree, and not instrumental in an actual new reset of Iran policy, so long as you keep the door open for the JCPOA. So as an Iranian American, my charge to the community is connect the dots, do exactly what Brian said, marry the issue for U.S. policymakers in terms of strategy and values. You say you can't stand with the Iranian people if you're going to be underwriting their aggressors. You can't deal with the ballistic missile issue if you're going to be removing from the sanctions list the defense industrial base of the Islamic Republic, which is getting stronger and more robust day by day. So it's actually helping everyone see the issue with the same framework. Now, when you go around D.C. and you start to talk to people abroad even, there is greater convergence on this issue, but there is still a hesitancy to move them towards this kind of policy of maximum support. Now, what will get people there? Two things. One, and they're both forcing functions, by the way. One, events on the ground in Iran, whether it is more enrichment by the regime, or more protests by the people, or more repression by the regime, or more regional escalation by the regime. What is happening in Iran internally, the contest between the state and the street, and the contest between the state and its near abroad and the region, will continue to play the role of a forcing function. So no matter how many times we want to put our blinders on, what happens in Iran will not be limited to Iran itself. It'll be global. You know, there was a time when policymakers used to make fun of Iranian drones. Now Iranian drones are in Europe. So the knife is moving closer and closer and closer. Routinely, IRGC officials talk about, well, they could grow the range of their missiles to potentially threaten Europe one day. They're working on things that could be the baseline for a potential ICBM one day. The IRGC literally calls the Europeans dwarves. Kutule, they use that word. They're mocking the Europeans routinely. So there are many things that can be a forcing function to get us to see this issue the right way. It's really a matter about wanting to pay attention to it. And that gets me to the second forcing function, things like many of you have been doing so great in this room, things like NUFDI have been doing so great, which is the advocacy to highlight the plight of the Iranian people, to highlight this broad interconnected spectrum of threats, to show the linkages between this, I don't want to use the word, but it's, March 2020, March 2023, this new proto-axis of evil that is emerging, this new authoritarian club that is emerging, to show the linkages there. And things like the Massa Twitter army, some of you know I'm not on social media, but I do try to follow this stuff. That is getting the attention of the policymakers. So, as an Iranian American, I have to say I'm very proud. Look at the jurisdictions that have parliaments calling for the sanctions on the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Australia, Canada, UK, EU. What do all of these jurisdictions have in common? And also, why is it that their parliaments are calling on the foreign ministries? What happened now, especially in this most recent iteration of protests, is that the Iranian community is now united in policy goals. We're not just saying support the Iranian people. People like Kamran and NUFDI and everyone else are saying, here's precisely how you can do it. And it's support for the people, pressure on the regime. So we are united in actual policy goals. You heard Shahzadeh talking about some of those specific goals at the Munich Security Conference this year. These are things that have to continue. And so long as they continue and they'll be public in the public domain, those two things, the advocacy of the community and the reality of the country and the region, will be a forcing function to take off those glasses and look at the nature of the threat.
Thank you. Brian, you touched on this a little bit when you first answered my first question, but I wonder if you can kind of foreshadow something for us. In recent years, in Iran policy has lacked bipartisanship, and I'm wondering if you think this maximum support strategy would get both sides of the aisle to come together and could maybe hopefully have bipartisanship on the issue of Iran. Maybe this maximum support could push, both the Democrats and Republicans to come together somehow on the issue of Iran.
Yeah, I think key elements of it can. Again, this is a very ambitious agenda, and this is a very divided town. but I do think that key elements of this could win the support. And let's be clear, though my first point was on constraints was that there's hyperpartisanship, and yes, that's the case. But let me tell you something about what's happened over the last year or two when it comes to broad national security questions. There has been actually a growing consensus on a range of issues. China, you see a committee right now in the House. I don't know if there are similar committees for Iran right now, but you have Republicans and Democrats looking and coming together to talk about how do you make America more competitive and then boost our defenses against what China is doing in the world. A clear example of Russia's invasion of Ukraine producing this strong rally around the flag approach in our politics, right? And then you get outside of the bubble, and when you know, U.S. politics, and especially the politics of foreign policy these days, often has very noisy elite actors that are disconnected from what the American public want. And I think you have sort of the makings on Iran, an opportunity to create, again, a solid, not just elite, but popular bipartisan coalition. In part because though there are red versus blue, Republican versus Democrat divisions, on the most important issues about our interests and values, and on polling when you look at attitudes towards Iran, the regime, versus the Iranian people, there's just a basic decency and support amongst the American public for people who are facing bullies, for people who are facing repression. And again, though we're still hyper-partisan, we have this new dynamic where the new paradigm is not red versus blue in the politics of national security, or neocons versus liberal internationalists. Those paradigms are old. The new paradigm I've written about this is clowns to the left of me and jokers to the right. Here I am stuck in the middle with you. And on those bigger ticket items where you've got a number of voices, China and Russia, where Republicans and Democrats have found common cause, even in the very confusing and chaotic era of the Trump administration. You look beneath the hood of U.S. foreign policy, it was there. Unfortunately, on most Middle East policy issues, whether it be Iran or Israel-Palestine or other things, you have very forceful, interesting, and at times amusing entrepreneurs on Twitter, sometimes in institutes that are advocating different positions. But it often does more to fragment the potential for coalitions in the United States for strong support than it does to actually move things forward. So there's a moment here. Again, the clock is ticking. I understand the 2024 dynamic, and it'll press whether it's Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis to distinguish themselves in different ways. What I would say for anyone who wants to lift up the voices of the Iranian people, try to do it in a bipartisan way. There's a moment here where you can find voices at the center in both parties that are internationalists, that aren't about so-called policies of restraint, or aren't stuck in sort of the most ironic sort of label these days are progressives on national security, who, when you think about it and you look at a lot of their proposals, they're stuck somewhere between 2003 and 2015. 2003 and railing against Cheney and the global war on terror, or 2015 and advocating for the JCPOA, which, full disclosure, I was in favor of at the time. And I do think we need some sort of modicum of support to deal with the nuclear issue, but it may not be the right vehicle these days. So there is an opportunity, but I do think it requires sort of a long game of building those relationships and support with both parties, not just one versus the other.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to ask one last question for Navid, and I'm hoping Kamran can cue me in if we have any time at the end for maybe some Q&A, 5 minutes, okay. So Navid, Kamran touched on it as one of the 15 pointers of maximum support, but I know one of the things that may come up is people will want to know, well, how is this policy going to be, is going to be costly, and who will carry the burden of paying for this policy? And I know it's touched on in everyone's brochure, but maybe you can speak a few seconds as to that.
Well, just a couple of days ago, I was reading a report of Iran-Iraq trade. Iraqi banks right now, they have more than $20 billion of Iranian assets. And the Iranian regime is not able to take that money because of the U.S. sanctions. We can use Iranian frozen assets to pay for these programs. And also we can redirect some of the existing funds of United States on Iran for the maximum support projects. And even if the United States pays for the entire maximum support program or projects like that, I think it's worth it. I mean, if you want to protect your national security, it has a cost. Look at the Iranian regime, how it's dedicated to supporting its proxies. Over the past 10 years, Iranian regime has spent $20 billion in Syria. They are giving money to Houthis, $100 million per year. And they are paying the salaries of Iraqi militants in Iraq, and more than 40 groups are active in Iraq right now, and $700 million per year to Hezbollah. So if you want to deal with the Iranian regime, I said there are other funds that you can use, the Iranian people's money, frozen asset, but even if the United States pays for this program, it's worth it because protecting your national security has a cost. If the Iranian regime is winning in every aspect of Iran-U.S. policy, maybe it's time for United States to wake up and compete with the Iranian regime. Look at how dedicated they are in supporting these proxies. And I think that Iranian people could be the best allies for the West and for the United States. They can be a force of change. Why not United States invest on Iranian people?
And it's in on national security.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, Navid. I think we may have time for maybe one or two questions. If
Yeah. Thank you. I think saying on the maximum support, it is very important and very long lasting, and it will have impact. My point is that it's maybe better to prioritize the group, the importance of activities, and regroup that in segments in order to have a better outcome for the implementation. Thank you.
do you want to, do you want to take that?
It sounded a little bit like a comment, and I'm sure the people doing the advocacy would take it to heart. But there's a DC line I'm sure everyone knows, which is march divided, strike united. So the people who are best placed to do the media stuff, do the media stuff. People best placed to do the security stuff, do the security stuff. But I'm sure, yeah, it should be a kind of a coalition. And again, connecting the dots between the people who can do it is going to be key. Because if you put 15 points with many subpoints, as everyone knows, in front of a policymaker, they're going to be shocked. First of all, no one reads anything over 2 pages, so we have a problem there. Second of all, making it digestible and piecemeal, one at a time. There's that Italian saying, politica del carciofi, take it one at a time like an artichoke, one at a time. This is about building an entirely new Iran policy. And one at a time. Small victories, for us, is going to be death by 1,000 cuts against the regime.
I'll bring it. Here you go.
Thank you very much for this gathering. I appreciate NUFDI for extremely informative dialogue here. And I'm so grateful Shahzadeh is here as well. Great to see you after a long time. The question that I have today is how in the last quarter century, the two worldview, this is for Brian, worldview informing American foreign policy, from preemptive strike to leading from behind, and America's reliance on energy or lack thereof in Middle East impacted the overall America's position in regards to Middle East and specifically Iran.
Yeah, I think those approaches, and I could go through the litany, especially 20 years after the Iraq War, of how it actually damaged our position and then our self-confidence in our ability to shape events. Because you had two different strands which these were attempts that didn't succeed either on their own accords. I think the Bush administration, particularly with the Iraq War, said that we were going to expand freedom in the world, we were going to stop the spread of nuclear weapons, and we were going to stop terrorism, right? And on all of those three accounts, at least for a decade plus, we didn't do very well. And the story of freedom in the world, if you look at the latest Freedom House report, does look very bleak, right? I think the Obama administration came in, and it wasn't just leading from behind, but they essentially said, well, we overreached, so we need to pull out of stupid wars, as they said. But ironically, President Obama was back in to Iraq and then Syria after the rise of ISIS in the Michael Corleone moment that he had for his Middle East. Every U.S. president has it for Middle East policy. Just when I thought I was out, I get pulled back in. But those two labels, sir, today are just irrelevant to the current times. There is actually, I wrote a piece this morning about swing states and important sort of middleweight powers like Saudi Arabia and others in the world. And if you look at sort of the one common thread between the Trump administration and the Biden administration and their foreign policy, and both sides hate it when I point this out. But they both have talked about this era being one of strategic competition, or under the Trump administration, great power competition. Both teams would argue that it's mostly China and Russia. What I think this report and a lot of this sort of smarter analysts that look at the Middle East and Iran in particular understand that the Middle East is an arena in which this competition is playing out. And quite clearly, we have seen which side Iran has picked in that fight that Russia picked in its invasion of Ukraine. We see, I think, pretty clearly the strands of what China is trying to do in trying to keep, good relations with both sides. But as I mentioned, that agreement that was announced on Friday, let's see. Let's see, when was the last time that the regime in Tehran actually lived up to its word across the board, and whether China actually feels like it achieved something. So the main point being is that I think Americans have learned a lot from that 15, 20-year period, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to be paralyzed by the past, by whether mistakes or missteps. So we're really good at self-flagellation in America. What we're less good at is building coalitions and talking about how do we move forward on tough challenges like Iran, and how to do things like lift up the concerns of the Iranian people.
Energy, oil.
On the energy, well, look, I mean, a lot has happened in that period, in the last quarter century you talked about. In that quarter century, America became a superpower, an energy superpower in its own right. And we all know it, and it is along with Saudi Arabia and a few other factors, they're a key player. And we use that power, I think, in ways that as the report talks about, we talked about here, as negative leverage in a sense, to sanction and give incentives to the regime in Tehran if they do this, this, and this. What I like about this report is it tries to change that paradigm, to think through in different ways. And what I like the idea of maximum support, and this is where I would try to extend it more, is after 2 decades of not using the power of America's economic statecraft, of not using the potential of different models that are emerging across the Middle East right now, where I think the people of Iran see what's happening in Dubai and in Saudi Arabia and other things, and they say, we want a little bit of that. Right? And we need actually more creative thinking, and I think this report does this by putting, again, here's the key point, recentering the people of Iran as a factor in the debate and what they want. And I'm pretty sure it's pretty clear what most of them want. They want freedom, they want abundance, they want prosperity. And getting from here to there and building a coalition that gets us there is I think, the central task.
Thank you very much.
I think our time is unfortunately up.
Yeah, I just want to make one last point. So I totally agree with Brian that we have to make the Iran issue a bipartisan issue in the United States. I personally believe in advocacy work. If I just give you one example, over the past 2 months, there was a bill introduced by Jim Banks, one of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives. The bill is called MASA Act. It is asking the United States President to make a determination in 90 days whether the Iranian regime supreme leader is eligible for human rights sanctions, and Biden will be on a spotlight to report back to the House of Representatives in 90 days. And also, it has a second component. So I don't want to talk about it right now, but because the Iranian American community was united in its support for Mahsa Act, we were able to get the co-sponsorship of the most progressive members of the House. We visited more than 100 offices, and we talked with many members of Congress. Everyone is surprised at how could you bring all these names together? The most conservative members of the House and the most progressive members of the House. Why? Because Iranian Americans were united. They stormed to the street of United States in so many cities. They called, and I think that American people are good people. When you humanize the Iranian people, when you show the bravery of Iranian protesters, especially the Iranian woman, fighting for equality, and when you humanize them and they hear their story, it's impossible for them to say no. So it's on the groups like NUFDI and other, Iranian American organizations to continue advocating for the Iranian people. They should expand their work. They should engage more policymakers. They should be in touch with their leaders in Congress and to advocate for the Iranian people, because American people are decent, they are good people, and they hear your story, and you can make an impact with advocacy work.
I want to thank again our panelists, Brian Katulis, Behnam Talablu, and my colleague Navid Mohebi, and thank you especially to our very capable moderator and NUFDI advisor, Afshin Latifi. Thank you for an excellent first panel. We'll now have a brief break to grab some coffee and some water, and we'll come back shortly for our keynote conversation. Thank you. I've just been reminded by my boss to ask everyone to please silence their cell phones. If you wouldn't mind even turning them off, that would be even better. Thank you very much. One of the great pleasures of the past several months at NUFDI has been the opportunity to add new members to our team. Today, you will meet several of them. Mina Nurbakhsh, our creative director, who is responsible for the beautiful pamphlets and everything that you've seen designed properly. Basically, everything that's gone right today has been thanks to Mina, the new member of our team. Obviously, you're all familiar with Navid Mohebi, who was in the previous panel, Andrew Khalili, our senior policy analyst, and of course, Ali Reza Nader, NUFDI's new engagement director. So we're thrilled to have Ali Reza speaking for the first time as a member of the NUFDI team. So welcome, Ali Reza, for this keynote conversation. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, it is NUFDI's distinct honor to host His Highness Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi as today's keynote speaker at the Maximum Support unveiling. All of you are familiar with the Crown Prince's long track record of being the foremost advocate for the Iranian people on the international stage, and support for his compatriots is something that he has dedicated his entire life of public service to. And so welcome, sir, as our keynote speaker today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good morning. I hope you're doing well. It's a real honor to be with His Royal Highness, the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, who just returned from a historic trip to Europe. You spoke at the Munich Security Conference, the first time ever that a true representative of the Iranian people spoke at that conference. This is a very important international event, usually attended by Islamic Republic officials such as Javad Zarif. You also spoke at the European Union, where you urged the Europeans to list the Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization. You spoke in the UK. There were some incredible scenes in the United Kingdom where you were greeted by hundreds of your compatriots. And you have been urging maximum support for the Iranian people for 44 years, Your Excellency. And I think this is one of the reasons that Iranians see you as their true representative. When you were in Europe, you urged the Europeans to invest in the Iranian people. Can you just tell us what you exactly mean by that? What are some of your recommendations to the Europeans? And also, we want to know, there's a lot of concern among Europeans that when the Islamic Republic falls, that there may be instability in Iran, there will be uncertainty. So if you could just talk to us about how the Europeans should see the situation in Iran, and why they should believe that Iran has a bright future under a secular democratic government.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today, NUFDI. I appreciate your invite and this opportunity to speak to all of you here today. The most fundamental issue that could be on people's mind, foreigners looking at Iran, is they say one thing: well, this is the devil we know when they talk about the regime. But yet we don't know what could come after. And first and foremost, if they look at the composition of various Iranian diaspora living in foreign countries, particularly European and Western countries, what type of people are they? Are they successful? Are they educated? Do they have talent, know-how? Are they managing corporations or running half of their own countries? Why would they have any doubt that these are the very same kind of people who tomorrow would lead and build their own country? Let us not forget that the first wave of Iranians who had to flee Iran, who were the initial or first generation of immigrants, came here, and today maybe the third generation are my own children, for instance, my youngest daughter being of that age, pretty much the same age of this whole Mahsa revolution, and they're represented. What kind of people are they? What kind of values do they fight for or die for, the same values of liberties and freedoms that we enjoy here in democratic countries. And we want the exact same thing for us. So if you put in doubt that the same people that need to be saved and help get rid of this regime would be different in character and nature and values than your own countries, then don't even bother looking at us. But if you do, what the hell are you waiting for? Because the most instrument for change, if it has to be from within, cannot be anything other than the people themselves. So therefore, why maximum support? Because when you are dealing with an extremely repressive regime, and we all know what it does to people, it would be very difficult to sustain continuous resistance to this regime without some added element that gives people hope for the future, that the end of this regime is near, that the world is finally recognizing that the Iranian people are part of the solution, while this regime continues to be part of the problem. Years ago, I've been arguing to the very same countries and Western nations that I visited recently, that your entire basis of foreign policy regarding Iran, including the sanctions, were based on a false premise and expectation, which was behavior change. This regime has proven that its DNA, its reason to exist, has nothing to do with the national interest of a country and its people. They are there only to export an ideology at the expense of the Iranian people. And for them to succeed, the rest of the world has to fail. It's zero sum. They cannot have actual coexistence with a world that is democratic when human rights are the element and basis of laws and rules. And as such, expecting them to change their behavior has been such a waste of time. And yes, because in some cases it was mishandled elsewhere, doesn't make regime change a bad concept. It was poorly executed in Iraq. And by the way, Iran is very different than Iraq. So why is it that what we are asking today governments to do is to understand that the element of change has to be first and foremost the Iranian people. And if you respect a nation's sovereignty and right to self-determination, that's exactly what we are asking for. What are we fighting for? I've been fighting 43 years of my life to get to the day we can have Majlis Muassasan propose a constitution to be ratified by referendum by the Iranian people. That's what our objective is. And if we believe in democracy, if we believe in the sanctity of the ballot box, it is our job to ensure that Iranians are not deprived of that right and that choice. That's what we are fighting for. But we need help. And in that context, my message had been, and again, in this round of talks, what was different was that it was the first time they finally decided to officially enter in open dialogue with representatives of the secular democratic opposition. Until now, their dialogue was limited to the regime and its representative. And we kept arguing, how could you possibly expect to have an answer to the problems by asking those who are continuously part of the, get an answer to a solution from the people who are the problem. We can offer you the solutions. But it's also another aspect. We talked about bipartisan support here. It's very important. I remember a few months ago I was in California and I was talking to a group of my fellow compatriots, and I said, we should take a book out of the experience that the Israelis have had. That when it comes to Israel, we expect bipartisan support for our country, regardless if you're Republican or Democrat. As the Iranians living in this country, I had the same ask. Say, make sure that your ask, whether you're voting Republican or Democrat, is we don't expect anything short of bipartisan support when it comes to Iran and our freedom and human rights. So that's very important. The same approach I took talking to legislators in Europe and saying that as much as we will give you a diversity of the Iranian secular democratic opposition, we would like you to also provide us with as much diversity within your own respective political parties. So we're not in dialogue only with one side of the aisle versus the other. And that's also very important because we don't want, again, the Iranian issue to become an issue of partisan politics, whether it's in Germany or France or England or wherever. And that was also very important. So I think that given the fact that this is fairly new, to be honest, for the first time they're beginning to hear us, it would take a little bit of time for us to be able to put all the nuts and bolts together, but this is a process that we are going through. As I speak to you right now, I can see much more coordination between Iranian opposition groups trying to work with one another at this stage. I can see a lot of specialists who want to enter the field and provide their ideas either before the transition or especially after the transition, and a roadmap for the future of Iran. For instance, when I was in in Oxford, that's particularly the kind of things we were talking about with the students, Iranian students who came from Cambridge as well. And we were talking about how important it is to have a lot more project-oriented actions, because it's easier to recruit for specific projects, whether you want to focus on legal issues or economic issues or environmental issues. And that is also necessary because, yes, we all understand the importance to have a democratic country in the future. But I think many Iranians are asking themselves the question, well, what's the roadmap to recovery? And on that basis, the rest of the world wants to also understand what's our roadmap to recovery and what's in it for them and what could be of mutual advantage. So these were, in that sense, quite a successful trip that I had as a first round of talks, so to speak, and I hope to continue on that together with other friends who are helping in this process and hopefully inform our fellow compatriots as to how we are progressing on that.
It's really great to hear that. I remember traveling to Europe several years ago to advocate for a policy of maximum support for the Iranian people. And I remember when I met with European Union officials, when I told them that I believe the Islamic Republic will be overthrown, they didn't believe me. And so you going there and getting that sort of reaction from them, to me, is kind of like a dream come true, frankly. And what do you think it will take for the people across the street to change their minds about Iran, to shift their focus? You know, I would have never thought that Europe would be more open toward a policy of supporting the Iranian people than my adopted country, the United States. What will it take for the White House and the U.S. Congress change its mind about Iran? When will people in this town wake up to the reality in Iran?
You brought up one element which I think is key in the process of transition, which was designating the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Why is that important? It's not only important because obviously curtailing them makes the regime less capable of using it as an apparatus of state repression at home or whatever they do abroad. It's also important because those of you who have followed my arguments all these years understand that I've always campaigned and advocated for a non-violent civil disobedience means of change as opposed to having recourse to arms and conflicts of that nature, which usually doesn't end up with a democratic alternative and brings the cost of change so much higher that it is unjustifiable. It is important in the sense that other than it could provide more assets, because let's not forget, the IRGC is now a mafia that rules the country, controls just about everything. Curtailing them means perhaps even more resources that could be repurposed, as we talked about today, about frozen assets and what have you. But it also will give more incentive to members, the core of the IRGC, to consider when it's time to join with the people and bail out with the system, because they cannot be associated with that kind of designation. It will, in fact, in my view, accelerate the process of defection, which is something we need. Because in order to have a policy of national reconciliation, we have to offer the bulk of them an exit strategy. And if they do not find in the future a place for themselves, they'll be forced to resist with the regime. And that, again, is costly to the country. So understanding that that scenario could, in fact, facilitate a more peaceful transition could not possibly be against the interest of any country, understanding that the change will need to happen, but how it will happen. It is important for them to understand that, as a consequence, we are talking about a controlled implosion as opposed to anarchy at the end of the day. That's the part that I think they need to begin to trust and understand, the mechanics of change. And as we have opportunities to explain how this can happen, as we can tell our own people why it is that they have to find a place beyond this regime. I'm not talking those who have committed heinous crimes and they will have to account for it. Them are just salaried people. They have to make a living. We cannot have the de-Baathification disaster that happened in Iraq happen in Iran. That's very key. We need to understand it as a people. The world needs to understand it when they look at us, and we need to communicate very clearly that we have an actual strategy and plan for that transition. I think that's the part that perhaps hasn't been looked to as seriously as it should have, but now that we're getting to this point, I think it is time to explain exactly what are the components for it and how this role could be important, among other things.
That's very interesting, controlled implosion, because usually Western officials don't view Iran in such a manner. And as you said, you've been a leading advocate of nonviolence in Iran for decades. And I think that's very important for everybody to understand that the solution in Iran is civil disobedience, economic strikes, teachers walking out of the schools. What should we expect American officials once the JCPOA ends? I think one of the biggest problems with American policy has been this hope, which I think is completely unrealistic, that the nuclear agreement can be revived. And I think the Europeans have begun to see the light as the Islamic Republic has really stepped up its support for Russia and Ukraine. European officials have changed their policies, and I think there could be a time when America realizes that also it's time to change its policies because the nuclear agreement is completely dead. When you look at Iran, what do you see as the next phase of this national revolution? And people constantly ask me that have the protests in Iran died down? Why aren't there people coming into the streets? What do you think it will take for the next phase of the revolution to really demonstrate to the world that the people of Iran will succeed against the Islamic Republic and lead the country to a future democratic system?
Well, on the first issue, very quickly, it's like you can have a gun and it has a safety that you can put on, of course. But the problem is not the gun. The problem is the finger on the trigger. So whatever you want to have as an argument, if JCPOA is that safety on the gun, and you think you're going to be safe now? No, it's the same finger who's going to put the safety off whenever they choose and pull the trigger anyway. Can you trust such a system after so many times cheating on whatever they had agreed to before? So that's that, and I'd rather focus on the second part of your question. Look, it is almost impossible for nations of the world looking at a country and its evolution to expect people at that level of excitement being on the streets every single day for months at a time. It's unrealistic, nor is it in that sense necessary. Because the protests had to send a clear message to the world that we want an end to this regime. Now, would you rather see our children be shot in the eye or poisoned by chemical attacks? Or if they were to stay home, nobody can force them out of their homes if they choose not to show up for work, which is why we are aiming for a strategy of maximum support that would lead to financing key sectors within Iran of the labor forces that can bring the final shock and paralyze the system to collapse. It can be done quickly enough, because if it's too long, the nation could also suffer from it a little bit. So the timeline could happen in a matter of a month or 2 months, maybe, of intense support. And if you do the math, we're not talking about billions of dollars. Imagine that 100,000 workers at an average salary of between $300 to $500 a month were to do it for 2 months at a time. You have a number right there. We're not talking billions here. So, and the funding, the money is there, if you come to think of it. And the delivery mechanisms, there are several ways to do it. I won't obviously unveil the details in front of the camera so the regime can find out about what we're planning to do. So obviously I won't do that. But there are ways of doing it. And it's important because let's not forget, in 1979, or before 1979, in the mid-1978, what finally brought the maximum pressure on the previous regime was the oil workers going on strike. Today, if you have transportation in Iran interrupted for a while, the whole system will come to a standstill. The regime won't be able to operate. People are already defunded. Our currency has been devalued to a point that I don't know which way it's going to end up. So it's not like before people were arguing, you know, the sanctions are going to hurt the people, or it's going to do this, it's going to do that. Well, look at where we are at now. At the time of the Green Movement, where were we at? 4,000, 5,000 reals 2 months to the dollar? What?
Yeah, 1,000 too.
1,000. What we are.
Now it's like 45.
So, well, you get my point. You get my point. The point is that this situation is unsustainable, but the solution is not to remove sanctions. It's in fact to push more for the regime to disappear, so all of the problems at the same time disappears. Not just the nuclear threat, everything else that we talked about earlier in the previous panel. But most importantly, it puts the people who can solve Iran's problem back in a seat. These people have been ignored by the regime. Specialists, the direct quote, that's what he said. And look at where we are now. So 80% at least of whatever will constitute the mechanisms of transition and rebuilding the country are already in Iran. They are already there. They don't have any posts. بلکه همه آقازاده ها همه جا رو گروه کردن. So the potential is there. And look at the role that members of the diaspora can immediately contribute to, bringing investment, bringing industry, bringing technology. That's the easy part. That's actually the easy part. You know what I'm most worried about? It's a cultural change. We need a new political culture. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's an educational process. But we have the other ingredients in place. And in that context, the world can then see that the country is not devoid of natural resources. It's not devoid of talent, from managers to directors to researchers to you name it. We are way ahead of many countries in Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union who had to restart. Much sooner than them we can do that. And then they will recognize that the sooner this is done, they can address their own immediate concerns even more. I think two main issues that was discussed in Europe, at least in the talks that I had, were the two obvious problems that they're facing. One is energy dependence and energy requirements. I just use one word, gas, Iranian gas. Iranian gas for decades could supply Europe so they don't have to be threatened by the limited choices they have right now in terms of energy needs. So Iran can solve that problem right away. Also immigration. Immigration is a huge problem for Europe. Europe is already saturated. They can't accept any more refugees. And if the situation in Iran were to continue, albeit for water crisis that Iran is facing right now, more people will have to be displaced. Where are they going to go? Many of them from the region may again head towards Europe. That cannot accept any more refugees, and it creates much more domestic issues for them as well. And you can stop that process and perhaps even reverse it. So these are the two immediate, tangible benefits that the Western countries can have in a change of regime in Iran that can have an immediate impact and reduce their concern. If they begin to see the light of how easily they can eliminate so many problems they've been facing because of the regime in place, but also how quickly they can benefit from what that change would mean to them, which is, I think, win-win, because the Iranian people will, of course, benefit from that. The sooner can we get back on track for rebuilding the country and getting the economy going on again. It will create employments at home and stability in the region, as well as reducing all of the concerns that, I don't know about the U.S., how far they will be impacted by that change, but Europe in particular will be most immediately impacted by that.
Yeah, you've been talking about a strike fund for a very long time, and I think that's a very key tool to use against the Islamic Republic. Right now, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of strikes going on in Iran. They have been going on for years, and that sort of civil disobedience, I think, is very effective. We've seen it in other countries. For example, the Solidarity movement in Poland was very successful in crushing communism through civil disobedience, and a similar method can be applied to Iran as well. When I talk to a lot of people in Washington, D.C. And in the Middle East, there is also concern for regional security when the Islamic Republic collapses. Of course, a lot of people in the Middle East want the Islamic Republic gone. Iran's neighbors have suffered immensely from this regime. This regime is responsible for the genocide in Syria and many other horrible acts. But while the Middle East wants this regime gone, there's also concern about what comes next, what kind of new Iran emerges out of the ashes. What's your message to the people of the Middle East? What can they expect from a secular, democratic Iran?
When you bring an element that reconciles our society in the sense that this regime from the get-go established a policy of discrimination against women, first and foremost, the first victim of this regime. They became second-class citizens. Discrimination against religious minorities, discrimination against the LGBTQ community in Iran, discrimination against ethnic groups and what have you. Basically, you can define the regime as being inherently one that only has a very narrow vision of itself at the expense of 95% of the Iranian population. So when you have a democratic country where all faiths will be free to practice what they want, nobody will question what sexual orientation you have or what political ideology you have, pluralism in the true sense of the word, and if you exercise it in your own country, the ramification of that vis-a-vis your immediate neighbors cannot be anything but positive, as opposed to a regime that wanted to create a modern-day Shiite caliphate. And the first challenge was to the Saudi royal family of whether or not they are the legitimate custodians of the Holy Mosque. It started from day one. So the Sunni-Shia conflict was in fact started by the Islamic regime in Iran, which obviously had been a big problem for our Arab neighbors. So obviously, if that element is gone, not only will they see that we are a nation of tolerance and we would like to have fruitful and cordial relationship with our neighbors because it is in our own interest, that will be an element that will create immediate relief and stability. And we'll be cooperating with our neighbors towards that goal. We have so many common issues to tackle together. It's not just an Iranian problem, it could be a regional problem. We can all work on that. So that demeanor, that kind of a change in attitude should be something that I don't see why it would not be welcome by any of our neighbors. But it's also something internal to us Iranians, which I like to emphasize. We have had 40 years of experimenting directly with a religious dictatorship. The issue of religion today in Iran, or for that matter, the argument about secularism, is today an understood argument. It was taboo to talk about religion 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Today it's not the case. So I think we are coming out of the tunnel and understanding the necessity of separation of church from state, as they say it here, as a prerequisite to democracy. Number one, but also in that finding our Iraniyat in contrast to Islamiyat doesn't mean that in order to be a nationalist, we have to be anti-Arab or anti-Islam or anti-anything. Why should we be anti-anything? And that's what we need to project. And that also goes back to that culture that I'm talking about. The traditional culture of conspiracy theories و چشمابی‌ها و همه چیزی زیر دست انگلیساست و you know what I'm talking about. All those kind of arguments, as opposed to, come on, let's grow up. It's the 21st century. We can all be educated. Let's do away with all these conspiracy theories. Let's be pragmatic and realist and understand that as long as our national integrity and sovereignty is respected, we will treat anybody who treats us that way the same, reciprocally. That's the basis of cordial relationship. And the most important thing, how many democracies have gone to war against each other in recent history? Democracies don't go to war against one another. Non-democratic countries do. So if we can be successful in having a democratic alternative in Iran, at least Iran will no longer be perceived as a troublemaker, but as the peacemaker. Iran will be seen as a country that actually contributes to more tolerance and more understanding, as opposed to bigotry or racism or fascism or anything that comes out of it. That should be our task as Iranians to say, we are proud to say today in the 21st century that our country can be, in fact, a real model for many other countries to follow. And I think we have that capacity. All that we need is to actually believe in that for a change, actually believe in ourselves for a change. Because we've been so humiliated, we have been so beat on the head, that sometimes I see that people are a little bit, how can I say, disheartened or not so sure. And yes, the element of trust has almost disappeared, and building trust back is very important. It's not an overnight affair. And the countries are successful, and nations are successful, and people are successful where they actually have faith in their own system and establishment. That's our domestic challenge, to make people actually believe in their institutions, believe in their own system, and know that they're responsible in preserving it, not be passive. They can't be just spectators. They have to own it in order to control it, in order to participate in it. And the minute we start doing that, I think we have actually started on a very positive and new journey, learning from all the experiences, of course, that we have acquired over decades, especially under this regime.
You're the first Iranian leader that I've ever heard talk about LGBT issues. And I think it's important for the world to realize that the national revolution in Iran is a truly progressive movement. We want Iran to make progress, the sort of progress we saw under your father and grandfather. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us today, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you all.
for sticking with us. For the end of the day, we have a fantastic panel showing some transatlantic alliance and coordination on Iran. We have two respected members of parliament. We have Mr. Ali Ehsasi, MP from Canada, and Ms. Daria Safai, MP from Belgium. And moderating today's conversation is the estimable Karim Sajjadpour, who also happens to be a good friend of NUFDI, and we're very glad to have you here, Karim. Karim is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and one of Washington's most respected Iran watchers and analysts, to moderate today's conversation on maximum support and how we can expand that beyond just the United States to other European and Canadian and other Western powers. So Karim, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a terrific discussion today. And you know, when I was growing up in the U.S., there were no role models for those of us who thought about the life and politics. It was really, when you thought about Iran, it was Ayatollah Khomeini. And inside Western governments, whether it was the United States or Canada or Europe, there were really no examples of prominent diaspora Iranians. So I'm so proud of Ali Essasi and Daria Safai, who are real role models not only for their own constituencies in Canada and Belgium, but also for many millions of Iranians. So Ali Essasi, to my far right, is an old friend. He's been a member of parliament in Canada since 2015. Daria Safai has been a member of parliament in Belgium from 2019 onwards. I heard someone say this morning talking about the importance of bipartisanship. Well, they're from differing parties, in that Ali is a member of a Liberal Party in Canada, Daria is a member of a Conservative Party in Belgium. But I think on this issue, there's probably a unity of purpose. So I thought what I'll do is start off with a few broad questions. I'd like to limit my time and then quickly open it up to all of you. So please have your questions ready. And perhaps the first question I'd like to start with, and I'll start with you, Ali, and to Daria, is I'm curious whether you believe that there has been a fundamental shift in Canadian public opinion about Iran, and within the halls of power in Canada, a fundamental shift in the belief that the Islamic Republic of Iran is no longer reformable.
Well, first of all, just wanted to say hi, Karim. It's great to see you here. I also wanted to thank NUFDI. I think today is a huge step forward because I think the global community has heard from all of us over the course of the past 6 months. But it's important that we move forward and that we actually provide policy prescriptions, which is exactly what NUFDI has been doing. Now, with respect to Canada's attitude towards Iran, this is a regime that has always been considered loathsome in Canada. Obviously, it goes back to 2004 when the Iranian-Canadian photojournalist Ms. Zahra Kazemi was killed in such a tragic manner. In addition to that, as you know full well, we had to deal with the terrible tragedy of PS 752 3 years ago. I think the problem we had up until more recently is many people labored under the illusion that there were good guys in Iran and there were bad guys. And I have to say, there were occasions where they would tell me that some of these Iranian diplomats are so incredibly charming and learned in fighting the good fight. Thank goodness, thanks to all the efforts and hard work of the Iranian-Canadian community, I think that they don't labor under that illusion anymore. And they recognize full well that the vast majority of Iranians want to see an end to this despicable regime, and that they should be focused on how we can move forward and how we can support Iranians in their courageous quest.
Thank you so much. How do you see not only the situation in Belgium, but more broadly in Europe? Has that fundamental shift also taken place in both European public opinion, but also in the halls of power, that this is a regime which no longer can be reformed?
First of all, I wanted to thank you for your invitation, Nufti. Thank you, Nufti. And also, I'm so glad to be among you guys today. And I'm so proud of the Iranian, and I feel so warm when I am with you guys. I wanted to say about the changing of the mentality in Europe in a global form of it. I have seen a lot of changes. Sometimes we forget that we are only 6 months after Massa, and the things that we have achieved, like getting the totally agreement of the European Parliament about the resolution of putting IRGC on the terror list of Europe. This is a big achievement. It was not possible 6 months ago. But of course, it's not enough. But let's do it together and continue to do it again. But when I look at it several years ago, there was just like reform can help. Reform is what the people in Iran, they want. I remember when I wrote an article for the newspaper, and they talked about, no, you don't know really what the Iranian people they want. You are just a dissident abroad. And when I look at it today, and they are just sending me the emails to ask my opinion, the opinion of Iranian people, I see a big differences. And even in the parliament, when I was busy 4 years ago, I was elected in 2019. We had Bloody November, and I wanted my colleagues to sign something for just supporting this protest. I saw my colleague, they didn't know about anything about Iran. But after 4 years, and okay, of course, having me in a parliament is just something that they cannot ignore, they have changed. Not only my party support Iranian people, the whole other parties from left to right, they just stand by Iranian people, and they hope that Iranian people can change Iran, but also the whole world, and they know it. So I'm glad to say that there are a lot who has been changed, but we should continue.
Thank you so much. So you both won elections, which is not common among diaspora Iranians, and to win elections you have to persuade people. And I want to ask you a two-part question on the art of persuasion. One is how, if you were advising the opposition in Iran, how would you advise them to persuade more Iranians to join the cause of the opposition? That's part one. And part two is how would you persuade the diaspora to better persuade whether it's European MPs or the White House to support the cause of political change in Iran and these policies, prescriptions which Nufti has released today? I'll start with you, Alijan.
Thank you. I was hoping you would go to Daria first, but I'll go with that. Great question. I think it has been very, very helpful to see our diaspora very, very active in numerous countries around the world. That has really raised their awareness as to how important it is that they focus on the issue of Iran as well. But I would say that as much as it's important for us all to demonstrate that we are united in wanting to see an end to this regime, that we should really try to do numerous other things so that they will focus their minds and they will be supportive of our efforts. First of all, we keep trying to persuade European countries or North American countries as to how terrible and horrid the regime is. Believe me, anyone who has any passing familiarity with the Iranian regime will know that it is a terrible regime. A country that does not uphold the most fundamental civic rights for its own people will obviously be a menace to the region in which it's situated and a menace to the international community. So I am firmly of the view that Western governments also understand that this is a terrible regime and that we are all better off without the Iranian regime. Where we should be focused on is providing concrete example as to what it is they can possibly do. We also have to shy away from being divided. I have seen that far too often. We're trying to push each other out of the way to say, hey, I understand the aspirations of the Iranian people better. That is not very, very helpful. We have to continue to be united, irrespective of whatever our perspectives are. And that's why it's very important to have people from different political persuasions sitting next to each other and talking about the significance of focusing on Iran. But also, in addition to that, I think all of our efforts should really be focused on being responsive to the daily challenges that Iranians face within Iran. It's no secret that this is one of the worst run countries in the world. Iranians have to contend with the worst economic situation imaginable. They have to deal with suffocating existence every single day. So to the extent that we do offer proposals, they should be squarely focused on the challenges that Iranians back in Iran are facing in their daily lives.
First of all, I should begin to say that about the Iranian diaspora and outside Iran, they have done a lot and they have done almost everything. Just a little example to say the reason that European Parliament has voted positively for IRGC, against IRGC, was the presence of thousands of Iranians on 16 January in Strasbourg. I mean, without them, there is no voice. You can just say it in the parliaments, but without this big amount of people who are just shouting for their country to make them believe in what they want to do is the good thing for the world, that was powerful. And that was exactly on that moment that even the president of the European Parliament, without knowing from before that she had a speech, she came outside and listen carefully. She said, to you Iranian people, you are on the good side of the history and we support you. So to say that this is only the power of our voice all together and unity all together. And also my, like in the parliaments, of course, I try to be more European Parliament member of the parliament, because this is how you should convince them to help the Iranian people, just talking their own languages. That means you should know, let them know that what you are doing is good, that it is for Iranian people, but also please put your own benefits on the table and look at it carefully. Isn't it better for you as European countries to have a democratic, liberal, secular future in Iran in place of that terrorist that now is ruling the country? Iran has a big potential, but please use it for your own belongs. And this is what I am trying to do there. I mean, I put the things that it is important for European countries, like they have a big problem with extreme Islamism in Europe. I invite them to listen carefully to what Iranian people they want. Secularism, the only country in the region who says, we don't want no more Islam to be in the politic. We want them separately. So why don't you use this opportunity to kill extreme Islamism in the whole world? Because I give always the example, like, as you know, when communism was in power, you had a big problem with this communism ideology. But when Soviet Union was finished, this communism was little by little dead. So let's do it with extreme Islamism, and the roots of this tree as there in Islamic Republic of Iran. And then we will have safety, we will have prosperity in the whole region. And also migration. Europe is having a big problem with this problem. You should talk to them. If Iran is prosper and a good country, why the Iranian? We are such a long time here, but we want to be in our own country. Let it happen. And if we are a good country, then we can have a lots of other potential that Europe can use. And this is how we should continue our fight together in the parliaments and outside it.
You know, there was actually a statistic I saw from a regime official, former Minister of Science and Technology, who estimated that the cost of Iran's annual brain drain is about $150 billion annually, which is almost as much as their oil exports. So it's quite remarkable. I only have one more question for the speakers, so please have your questions ready. My final question is with regards to one of the maximum support prescriptions of NUFDI's booklet today, which is to prevent Western countries from being a safe haven for Islamic Republic officials and their offspring and their capital. And this is much more egregious in Canada and Europe than it is in the United States. And so I'm curious, to what extent have you guys been involved in these conversations, and how do we deter this challenge?
Absolutely. Before we get into that, I just wanted to say one thing, if I may. And that is, I think we should all be very, very optimistic that courageous Iranians will prevail. Now, you're looking at me wondering why I would say that. First of all, we have all been inspired by how courageous and how defiant young Iranians have been. In addition to that, we do know that polls that have been conducted within Iran demonstrate that as much as 80% of Iranians are fed up with this regime. And there's no reason for them not to be fed up. They have suffered through 44 years of mismanagement, kleptocracy, and the lack of civil rights. In addition to that, let's look at the other elements as well. We have a diaspora, and this really ties in with what you were saying, Karim, which is 8 million strong. This is a diaspora spread out in various countries around the world that is truly impressive. Every realm of life you look at, there are Iranian Americans, Iranian Canadians, Iranian Europeans who are doing an exceptional job. So let's have faith that members of the diaspora are also going to put their shoulders to the wheel. Lastly, I'm so happy to see that Iranians are getting along. They're working together. We see a broad-based coalition of Iranians coming together and recognizing that they all have to work together. So if you look at all those elements and you recognize full well that the Islamic regime is bereft of any solutions, is incapable of reform, I have no doubt that better days are ahead and that we will prevail. As for your question with respect to the progeny of Iranian officials, I regret to say, let's bear in mind that we do live in countries where there is law and order. So as much as I find a lot of people reprehensible because of their family ties, there's no easy solution to those things. If someone has been living in the United States for many years, or in Canada, or anywhere else for that matter, I think the critical part really is that all of our respective countries should be doing a much better job screening to make sure that those people never are allowed to set foot in our countries, because they most certainly don't share the same values that we cherish, and they really are a menace to all of these countries. So first step should be that we should prevent these individuals from coming to our countries. And the second one, in my opinion, should be should they be living in our midst, I think various countries should be watching them like a hawk, because so many of these people are just into wiring the ill-gotten gains out of Iran, and our agencies should be watching them very, very closely.
Thank you for all those explanations. I just should continue in the way that I wanted to say that there is a lot who has changed in our hearts in these last 6 months. And we know that, and we feel it. Already several months we have slept with the iPhones in our hand, just looking at those innocent faces, crying for them, and more than crying for those children, innocent children, crying for their parents. I have seen my son beside me, and I thought about how lucky I am, but why? And how should I be embarrassed of being so lucky to have him, but why are they gone? So the things that in our heart has been changed has guided us to a way, all together or nothing will happen. Today we are all together and we are beside each other, shoulder to shoulder, and we want only one thing, to take our beloved country back. And we will have it back. And I hope in this way we don't lose each other, because we are responsible for the bloods that we have lost. And we hope that it won't happen, but we are sure that it will happen. This is the way of revolution. We are still on the highest point of our revolution, although some of the countries or politicians or people asking me in my parliament, is it done? Is it finished? And I should always, every moment, I stand, although I know that we can do more, but I stand my foot and say, it's not finished and it won't finish. The day that it's finished is the day of the victory. And you will see and you will always remember me, because I know that we are going to finish it. This time, they have been too far. And we, Iranian people, even if they thought maybe some years ago, we don't want to die, maybe we can reform our country, they know we cannot reform it. And they say, we will give our lives for our country. Let's do it all together. And I hope in this way, we use our other experiences and stand with each other, because we cannot do it alone, and we cannot do it with only a group of members. We should be all together, and I hope soon we celebrate our freedom, the freedom of our country, in our own country, where we find each other, we dance with each other, and we will be happy together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have a time for a few questions, right? One question? A few, okay. So if you can please identify yourself and be as concise as possible. I will start in the front with my good friend Nazi Moinian. Is there a microphone? Here, I'll give you my microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful remarks. Thank you, Karim, for asking excellent questions. Nazi Moinian from Middle East Institute. I wanted you to contrast the fight for freedom in Ukraine versus Iran, and in vis-a-vis your exposure and your experience in the parliament, how much of what's going on in Ukraine has sucked the oxygen out of the fight in Iran, and how much has it helped? Thank you.
It's in Europe. So
Okay. Yeah, sure. And I have been 3 weeks ago, I have been to Ukraine. This is a very good question. And this has also changed a lot about how Europe is thinking about Iranian regime, because they have seen what we are saying is right. What we have said whole our life is the killers of Islamic Republic won't stop there, won't stop in Iran. They will come to you. They have been already several times to you with terrorism that they even planned in your own countries, like 2018 in Paris. Asadullah Assadi, terrorist and diplomat of the Islamic Republic, has planned a terrorist attack on the European soil. But even they have been further than that, and this is very important, and I try to emphasize it in the parliament, and also when 3 weeks ago I went to Ukrainian parliament to talk to my colleagues, I told them that they should also work more on it. This is important to remember them. Islamic Republic has chosen the enemies and friends, and you have a proof of it. You see it obviously that they have chosen to give Russia the drones and weapons against Ukraine, which is also European soil. And if Ukraine, which is now fighting for a year so courageously, they lose, is also one of the reasons is Islamic Republic. What do you want to do with them? And this is how also it had a very important influence on the mental change of the politicians and the ministers in European countries, because they see every day how they have been attacked through Russia and with the help of Islamic Republic of Iran.
So first of all, allow me to say, I think every single one of us can say how inspired we have been by Ukrainians. They have proven to be incredibly resilient, and they've been doing very, very difficult work. But I think it's important for all of us to bear in mind, there are many crises around the world as we look at things. And it's important for us to bear that in mind, because obviously many of us are focused on Iran, but in addition to Iran and Ukraine, there are many more crises as well. And that's a challenge. And the challenge is, as Daria can tell you, when you first arrive in Parliament, you're fixated on the issues that you care about, but you come to realize there are so many different things that elected officials are trying to juggle. And that really is the art of advocacy, trying to cut through and making sure that those issues that you care about, you do so in a concerted fashion. But just like I'm sure Ukrainians have inspired Iranians, and Iranians in turn inspired Afghans, it's important that we point out to the world that Iran is not only a menace to its own people, but it's a menace to the security of Europe, and it's a menace to its own region. We're all in this cause together. European governments can't pretend that Iran will just, at some point change its stripes and do anything to promote international stability. In fact, to the contrary, as we know full well, Iran has provided drones to Russians. So this commonality of the challenge that faces Iranians within Iran and Western governments is something that we should be highlighting and making sure that politicians in the West recognize full well how important it is that they take concerted action against Iran, because that's good for Iranians and it's good for global security. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's bunch together a few final questions. Gentleman in the front.
My name is Farman Kaleye, and I've been called worse. So, first of all, I want to thank you, Mr. Karim Sajjadpour, and Banu Safai, and for being here and being the voice. In Iran, we say Shir Zand. You're really an exemplary leader. Thank you very much for everything you have done. One of the key questions that's been in my mind is that Islamic radicalism, as we know it in the last 44 years, started in Iran, which was a gift, unwanted gift from Europe. We are blamed for it, but also the idea of Iran becoming a democratic, secular government could be country could be the start of a new, DNA for Middle East. There's no question about that. But my question is a characterization of this social movement and social behavior that's happening in the streets of Iran when they're knocking off the turban of the people, clerics. It just questions the entire legitimacy of the regime. However, you have a megaphone, you have a platform. If we start characterizing this social movement as a renaissance movement, I think Europeans maybe can relate to it a little better. What do you think?
It's a very good question. Let me bunch together a couple more. Was there any on this side? Gentleman in the back. And then we'll go to here, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you so much. My name is Hiva Kamangar. I'm with Institute of Diplomacy and Human Rights. So, talking about IRGC and listing as, designating as a terrorist group, and we all know the stories from Strasbourg to Brussels. And so my question is, are there any diplomatic high-level communications going on between European Union or Canada and United States to basically try to save time and try to avoid reinventing the wheel? Because we know that back in 2017 and 2019, they have been enlisted as an FTO. Thank you.
And final question here.
I appreciate it. This is Arshia Komeli. My station is AK Arshi. I'm a rapper director from Houston, Texas. And we had the opportunity to meet at the protest. So it's a pleasure to be here. And so the thing that I want to talk about is, it's a question. How can we keep younger people more involved? Because my generation feel left out, to be honest. And we are powerful in the streets. But when it comes to societies like this, we don't really have that much representation. And because you're also connected to people in European Parliament, I want to ask if maybe you can keep them more involved. Maybe I don't know, be more in touch with the younger audience a little bit more, because I have a big fan base. I have a big social media following, and unfortunately, I see the same thing, especially from kids in Iran, that they do feel left out. So how can we keep them more involved? Because that's important, actually.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. Ali, do you want to begin and go to Daria?
Sure. I'll begin by saying yes, absolutely, of course, the courageous young Iranians feel left behind. Let's not forget that every revolution that has happened in Iran, and we can start with the constitutional revolution, started because Iranians were of the opinion at that particular juncture that they were not keeping up with the rest of the world. So I certainly understand the frustration of young Iranians who want to see and live a life which is very similar to the lives we can all lead elsewhere. But we cannot despair. Despairing is a very simple thing to do. I would suggest that rather than despair, we should all redouble our efforts. Again, it's important that we tell European parliamentarians and North American politicians how important this is. We have done that. They all know what a terrible regime the Islamic Republic is. And now we got to demonstrate that we're committed to see change within Iran. We have to build relationships with politicians. It's not only about demonstrating, it's about, each of us going and meeting with congressmen, going and meeting with senators, going and meeting with members of parliament and saying, listen, we have some solutions. And no solution could be more powerful, in my opinion, than making sure that European and North American countries act in a coordinated fashion. When you're dealing with an entity such as the IRGC, I really want to see all the Western countries actually sharing intelligence, helping each other out to make sure that they can get in the way of the activities of the IRGC. This is an illegal entity that engages in criminal activity. So it's high time that we remind Western politicians that they should all be working together to make sure that they can defang the IRGC and that they support the people of Iran. Thank you.
About the first question, is it Renaissance and Islam? I should say this is absolutely a Renaissance. And also when I am talking with my colleagues and in Parliament, I emphasize on the point that Islam is a religion like every other religion, but it has also Sharia laws, and which makes it much complicated. And also, it's very in the highest point of Middle Ages. Actually, is like Christian religion. They had it before 500 years ago. The Islamic Republic has made it that it takes the power now in 20th century and now in 21st century. So when I'm talking about it, and I say just you should be grateful to Iranian people who are bringing a change in a religion which is, for the moment, today, in a lots of countries there, is also a sort of related to a very aggressive and radical form of it. But Iranian people is going on working on it so that it becomes, again, a religion just for calming your heart like a religion should be. But this is very important to continue to emphasize it, because they see how in this last 40 years, 30 years, also Islamism has taken a very big place in Europe, whole Europe. And they want also to get rid of this political form of Islam. And I say the solution is in Iran. Just help those people to win. About the second question about IRGC, I should say we are in contact with a lots of countries. And also, I should say that about the ministers, for example, of European Union, the countries of European Union, those ministers, they are not all against to put the IRGC on the list. There are lots of them who want it. And recently I have read a report about why Germany wants to put it, for example, because IRGC has helped on the extreme right swings, extreme rights, anti-Semitism in Germany for against the Jewish community. This is just awful. And that's how there are lots of ministers who want to realize it, and they are continuing to discuss it together. And I am sure if we are also continuing our fight, we will win. And about the last question and about the young people in Iran, I should say we are responsible for them. We should do everything that we have in power. Even if we don't have it in power, we should seek the power to be their voices and to make them free, because this is the revolution of 57 has happened because of a lots of mistakes who has given the hand to each other. The generation of our parents or grandparents, they didn't do their job as it should have been. So now that we know that we was the victims of those irresponsibility of giving a country like this to Islamists, now we are responsible to take back this country for our next generation. And I have a daughter of 21 and son of 16, and my dream is like their dream. They are born in Belgium, but they dream of going back to Iran one day. I hope that we can manage it, but we should be their voice, and we will continue to support them. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for coming all the way from Europe, from Canada,
Pleasure.
to join us. I know I speak on behalf of not only everyone in the room, but millions of Iranians worldwide, to thank you for your commitment, your role models. Public service, we know is not an easy job, but we really appreciate all that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
As Karim said, thank you to Ali Essos and to Daria Safai, but thanks also to you, Karim, for your estimable moderation of this conversation. And thanks to each and every one of you who joined us in person today from the diplomatic corps, from the media, activists from across the country, think tank experts, and to those who've been watching this event live and who will watch it later, for joining us as NUFDI unveiled the maximum support policy. In the coming weeks and months, you'll hear more about maximum support, not only about the proposed components of this policy, but also on NUFDI's follow-up on the implementation of each of these 15 points. So thank you to our speakers, and thank you to all of you for being here today.